I thought it would be a good idea just to do a really quick review. If we go back maybe just a couple of weeks here in the story, we talked about how Moses, he was a shepherd for 40 years, right? He was in the land of Midian, he was a shepherd, he was out in the middle of nowhere, and then he meets up with God in this most amazing way at a burning bush. Except the bush didn't burn up. It was burning, but it didn't burn up. And God calls Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. And he was just like, yes, let's go do it, God. That's what he did, right? No, that's not what he did. He was pretty reluctant, came up with all kind of excuses. He finally just flat out told God, like, I'm not doing this. But over time, we know that eventually he did. And so he goes to Egypt, and he stands before Pharaoh, who has a really hard heart, and he will not let them go. And so God sends down 10 plagues on Egypt, and after a while, after that 10th plague, they are set free. And it looks like things are going to be smooth sailing, right? Like, hey, we've been in captivity all these hundreds of years. We're now free. Things are going to be great, you know. But that's not really what happens. Because we know they cross the Red Sea, and then once they cross the Red Sea into the Sinai, let's just say they get a little bit lost. I've got a map here for us today to look at. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but what this does is this shows us approximately what this journey was like for the Israelites after they left the land of Egypt. You can see where it starts up here, you know, and then they cross the Red Sea, right? And then they kind of wander around. They end up down here in Mount Sinai. And so we would think that God would say to them, okay, you've been set free. We're going to take the direct route right off to the Promised Land. Because the Promised Land is only about 160, 170 miles away from where they were in Egypt. You know, I mean, that's not too bad. I mean, if you were to think about it, if you were to put it in context, we bring a map here of Indiana. If we were to go from where we live, about here, all the way up to South Bend, Indiana, that's about the same distance, okay? So it's not a humongous journey. Yeah, it's a lot of walking. But let's say that today, let's say right now, we wanted to be like the Israelites. And we just all get up and we walk out the door. You all want to do that? You all want to walk up to South Bend today? No takers on that? Okay. Well, all right. Well, let's just say if you did, all right? Let's say if you did decide to walk all the way to South Bend. I mean, we're talking, I don't know, maybe 64 hours at a normal pace of walking, you know, a little bit fast, but in 64 hours, if you went nonstop, yeah, you could get up there. But this isn't what happens with the Israelites. They don't take the direct route straight from captivity into the Promised Land. No, instead, God takes them on what we might want to call the scenic route, doesn't he? He takes them on the scenic route through the Sinai. And let me tell you, something I've learned through the years of my own life, and I've seen this over and over in the Bible, is that God likes to take the scenic route with things. He does. He doesn't usually, sometimes he does, but he doesn't usually take us on the direct route in life. He takes us on the scenic route. And so that's what happens to Israel. They take the long route. They cross the Red Sea. They go down the Sinai. They get the 10 Commandments down there. They stay there for about a year. They construct the tabernacle. They learn about sacrifices. They learn about offerings for their sin. And why did this happen, though? Why did they go down there and make this pit stop? Why did they end up wandering for 40 years? Why were they going, in many ways, if you go back to that map, if you can go back for me to this map, why did they go the opposite direction? I mean, they were here, they could have gone like that, but it said they'd come down here. Why did they go the opposite direction? Because after 400 years of slavery, you would think they would want to get home, right? But that's just not what's happening, because what God does during this period of time is He uses it, I think a good way to kind of characterize it, He uses it as a period of spiritual detox, okay? He uses this as a time to reconnect with His people and to work through His people and to grow His people closer to Him. And so they start, after being at Sinai, they start moving again, and God kind of gives them this, I guess what you could call this supernatural GPS, right? A pillar of cloud by day and fire by night to kind of guide them along as they go through the Sinai in the wilderness. And most of our passages today that we're going to look at comes from Numbers and Deuteronomy. We're going to jump around quite a bit today, so just follow along with me if you can, or you can just watch the screens. But if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 1, in Deuteronomy 1, verse 2, it says this: "It takes 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea," which is the south side of the Promised Land. It's kind of like on the border of what we would call the Promised Land, "by the Mount Seir road." So again, they are told to go down, we turn right on the Mount Seir road, we go straight for a few days, you hit the Promised Land. That's how long it was supposed to take. But we know that it took them 39 more years. Now, somebody wasn't very good at directions. Anybody in here not good with directions? You ever get lost? Yeah, we've all done that. We all get lost, right? I might have shared this story before, but I think it's funny. When I lived in Florida, I decided with my brother and some of his friends to go to a Reds game. They were playing the Florida Marlins. I guess it's Miami Marlins now, but they were playing at a stadium down there that I'd never been before in Miami. We jump in the car, we drive down the road, thinking, it's, down near Miami or whatever. We end up in downtown Miami, only to find out that the stadium is not in downtown Miami. Remember, this is before GPS, okay? We didn't have that. And so I'm like trying to find this place in Miami, and I go into the Cuban area of Miami, and I'm asking questions, and nobody knows English, so I'm not able to figure it out. I end up at what used to be, I don't think it's even there anymore, the Orange Bowl. It's tore down now, I think, but I'm like there. And by the way, we never ended up at the Reds game. We just drove back home. All right. I mean, it was like the worst trip ever. Like, we try to go to find this stadium, we just can't find it. And part of the reason, as I look back now, why I didn't find it, because I didn't ask for directions. At least not in the right places. And I still, to this day, hate asking for directions, because that's not manly. It's not manly, right, guys? We can figure this out on our own. We don't need somebody else's help. Hey, even if it means I miss the game and we don't get to have fun, I'm sticking to it. I'm not getting the right, I'm not going to get directions. That's why GPS is so wonderful. Because with GPS, I don't have to ask anybody for directions. But anyway, all right. I'm glad Adriana's not here today, because she'd be like, "Yep, that's you, buddy. That's you. That's you." Maybe the Israelites should have done what's in it. This is one of my favorite cartoons of all time. I wanted to share with you. Here's Moses. He's out here saying, "Follow me, let's go, everybody." And then down here it says, "After 39 and a half years of wandering in the desert, Miss Moses secretly asked for directions." Okay? That's kind of what you would think would happen here. But again, God is leading them. He is leading them in a different direction than what maybe we would think. And it's because He was going to work on them and work through them a little bit. Whenever I travel, I know nowadays we're in this age of GPS, and when you're using GPS, it often says that how long it's going to take you, right, to go from point A to point B. Like it'll say it'll take you this many minutes. How many of you all ever see that and say, "I'm going to shave a few minutes off this"? Any of you think you're going to? I did that yesterday. I was driving back home. I'm like, "I'm going to shave a few minutes off this." I took 4 minutes off, all right? Now, that's good, isn't it? Yeah, that's something to be proud of. Now, usually that comes at the cost of probably breaking a few speed limits, or cutting some corners in some areas. But hey, those 4 minutes, you'll never get those 4 minutes back. So you have to, you got to get there as fast as you can. See, this is not at all what happens to the Israelites. They end up wandering. And that's what our title is today. Wandering, I guess if you wanted to, we could define it as this. Wandering is living in the space between where I started and where I want to be. I think a lot of us here today find ourselves in that space. We find ourselves in that space of where we are and where we've been and where we want to be. We're not to where we want to be yet. I think that's where we find ourselves, and that's where the Israelites find themselves. But I want you to know something today. If you find yourself in that space, God does most of His work in that space. He does most of His work in that wandering space, in that in-between space. Think of it like the different stages in your life. Maybe it's a stage between graduating from high school or college and getting a job. Or maybe it's living in the space between dating and getting married. Or maybe it's living in the space between deciding to start a family and having a child. Or living in the space between receiving a diagnosis, a cancer diagnosis, and then finding remission. Or maybe it's living in the space between going into debt and getting out of debt. Maybe it's living in the space of being let go in your employment and finding new employment. See, living in the space is where God does His work. And the question for us today, and really the question that was in front of Israel, was this: how do you live in the space between? How do you live in the space between? How do you respond when God is taking you through a period of your life that is a time of wandering? Because most of us do not do well with this. Most of us do not do well with this. We just want to get there. We just want to get to that place. You know, I think this whole thing starts out when we're really young. When we're young, what do kids do on the whole trip when they're young? In the back seat, they say what? Are we there yet, right? Are we there yet? Yeah, I mean, over and over again. Now, I want to show you this picture. Look at these kids. They look all happy to be in the back seat of the car. That is not at all what the back seat of our car looked like. I mean, man, our kids are like, you know, getting on to each, especially as the trip goes on, right? And they're bored and everything else, all right? My kids were pretty good travelers, maybe not this good. They didn't wear like matching shirts and stuff like that, all right? But you get my point. Like, it starts really young. When we're young, we ask this question: are we there yet? Now, our tendency, and here's something else I want you to think about today. Our tendency, we'll put it here on the screen, our tendency is to try to eliminate as much time as we can between where we are and where we want to be. We want to try to figure out a way in life to get from point A to point B in the shortest time possible. We want to find a way to maybe even cut some corners if we have to. We live these lives of hurriedness. I want to do a quick little quiz with you. And you're in church today. You have to be honest, okay? All right? I'm going to ask you some questions. You've got to be honest anytime, but you're at church, okay? All right, I'm going to ask you a few questions. How many of you have ever cut through a gas station parking lot to avoid a light? Yeah, there you go. Hurriedness, right? We want to get from point A to point B as fast as we can. Don't want to wait for the light. We're going to just cut right through this gas station. How many of you frequently look at your watch? How many of you have done that already here since I started preaching? Phil has done it already since I started preaching. Thanks, Phil. All right. But you're being honest. I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate that. You know there's a few other ones in here, all right? You know who you are. All right? How about, okay, I'm just being, I'm trying to be honest here with you guys. You ever talk to somebody that talks really slow? Does that annoy you? I have to admit sometimes it does, okay? I try my best to like keep connected, but it's really hard. Why? Because we want to get from point A to point B in the conversation. We want to get there as quick as we can. How many of you, have you ever, I've noticed this isn't happening quite as much as it used to, but it still happens occasionally. It happened to me a couple weeks ago. I was at Walmart, and somebody was paying using a check, like a paper check, okay? And you're standing in line, that's kind of sitting there waiting. That could be a little rough sometimes, right? See, what I'm trying to point out here is so often we are in such a hurry that we want to get to point A to point B that we don't pay attention to the journey in between, okay? I know there's even some of you in here this morning. Is there any of you in here this morning that like probably when the closing song, like as soon as the song's done, boom, you're to the car? Any of you like that? Yeah, there's a few of you, okay? All right, we're hurried. We're hurried people. We don't like the journey. You know one other thing I don't like to do when I'm on a journey? When we used to drive with our kids, and my kids were pretty good about this, I hated stopping at the rest stops for bathroom breaks. Like, I'm like, wait till we need gas, and when we get gas, then you go to the bathroom. That way we're hitting two birds with one stone, right? But again, that's that whole hurriedness thing. We're just in such a rush, all right? See, the inescapable conclusion, though, as we read this story, is this, and that is God is not in a hurry. We're always in a hurry, but God is not in a hurry. He's not in a hurry at all. See, we've seen some of this happen already in the story. If you think of the first 5 or 6 chapters that we've gone through here, he tells Abraham that he's going to father this great nation, but he waits for how many years? I mean, he had to wait decades before he had his first son. Joseph, he was in prison for 13 years before he reached the end of where God wanted him to be. 40 years that we're going to see, what we're seeing here today of the Israelites in the desert. Later, we know that David had to wait for 20 years before he was anointed king of after he was anointed king of Israel to become the king. See, here's what you need to know. You need to know this. See, God is more concerned about who you are becoming than where you are going. He is more concerned about who you are becoming than where you are going. So right now, in that place in your life, in that in-between space, in that wandering that you're going through, you're wandering because he's more concerned about what you are becoming than where you are going. So God has Israel in this wilderness, and He's going to work during these 40 years. He's going to work in the hearts of the people that are there because He cares more about who they are, not that they get to the promised land. And this is the same for all of our lives. Wandering is a part of what God, or of who God wants us to be. So how does the Israelites deal with this wandering? They're like, yeah, God, we're glad to wander for 40 years. This is going to be great. Out in the desert, wow, this is amazing. I know you're working on my heart and my soul, God. So 40 years, 60 years, go for it. Whatever you need to do. That's what they say, right? No, that's not what they say. They complain. They whine. Poor Moses. Now, you could say that what was going on was unbelief. Okay. I mean, they didn't trust the driver, and in this case God, who was driving them. They didn't trust Moses, who was kind of the co-pilot, right? So what do? They complain about the food. If you look in Numbers chapter 11, verse 4, it tells us that they complained about the food that they were given. They complain about the food. They said that, hey, this one cracks me up. They complained that their life was better as slaves. They're like, Moses, our life was better when we were slaves. If you look at Exodus 16, it says this, in the desert the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. So now they're saying they'd almost rather be dead than in this position. And then they said this, there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. So what they're saying is they would rather be slaves. I mean, the way that they're looking back at it, it's almost like they're having this big fondue party or something back in Egypt, right? And they're all sitting around enjoying the food and just having a great life and a good time, which that's not what was happening. They were slaves. And yet, they complain. And that's the thing. That's what complainers do. Everything is better on the other side. Whining and complaining can often be the theme of a journey when you're wandering. And that's what Israel chose, and that's what we can do too. But what's beautiful about the story of these 40 years, 39 years or so of wandering in the wilderness is that God extends His grace, He extends His provision to them. He provides for them over and over again. He continues to provide. He gives them water from a rock. He gives them quail to eat. He gives them manna from heaven. In Deuteronomy, we read that God miraculously gives them sandals on their feet and clothes that last longer. So think about it. All their needs are being met, and what do? They complain. And here's the thing about complaining. Complaining is often contagious. You've probably gone through this at work. Maybe there's somebody that complains about the boss or complains about this all the time. And then what happens? It tends to spread. It happens in our families. It happens even in churches. Complaining, here's the thing. Complaining is contagious, and it's a toxin. And that's what was happening. Because complaining robs the joy out of a person's life, and it robs the joy out of other people's lives as well. Some years ago, there was a study that was done by the University of Denver with married couples in their first 10 years of marriage, and they found out that they wanted to find out what one of the ways, one of the signs of a couple that would stay together. And what they found is that marriages with 5 or less negative comments among 100, so less than 5% of the conversation or the comments had complaining, 5% or less, those marriages had a great chance of surviving for a long time. But marriages that had a greater occurrence of 5% of complaining in the marriage, they often didn't make it. That's what happens with complaining. It becomes contagious. It's a toxin. And eventually, God, after providing all of these things and trying to get them to the place where they needed to be, not to the promised land, but who they were as people, as a nation, God finally has enough if you look in Numbers chapter 11. Because in Numbers 11, he tells the people, he says, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow, and you will eat meat. The Lord heard you when you wailed. If only we had meat, we were better off in Egypt. Now the Lord will give you meat, and you're going to eat it. I love how that says that. It's like my mom, when I was growing up, and she put a plate in front of me. You're going to eat this. I remember one time I was at a babysitter's house, and I was probably like 5 years old. And I could still remember this. It's crazy. Like, she had put peas on my plate, and she's like, you're going to eat them. I think I sat there for like 2 hours. Like, I don't think I ever did eat them. She's probably still got that plate sitting on her table. But anyway, see, God says, you know what? I'm going to give you this meat, and you're going to eat it, and you're not going to eat it just for a day or two or for 5 or 20 days or a whole month. In fact, you're going to get meat all the time. So much so, you're going to be overwhelmed by it. And here's what God is doing. God, in this time of wandering, He is giving them perspective, and often this is what our complaining needs. Sometimes, in the middle of your complaining, God gives you something, and you find out that, wow, why was I complaining about this? I've had that happen to me a few times. Because God provides. God provided for them. See, we lose sight, all of us here, we all lose sight of how blessed we are. We all lose sight of how much God has provided for us. John Ortberg once said that what would change our lives more than anything else is if we would just look at different situations in our lives and just answer them with these 4 little words. And maybe some of you do this already, but these 4 little words that he thinks that we need to have is this. He says, it could be worse. It could be worse. But we don't tend to do that, do we? You know what we tend to do? We tend to say, I deserve better. I deserve better than this. Rather than saying it could be worse, we think, I deserve better. What do we tend? We tend to say, God, this isn't fair. I want this. But what if we just looked at life and we said these 4 little words? It could be worse. It really would give our complaining some perspective, wouldn't it? It would maybe make us more grateful. So when you leave here today, don't go to where you live and think to yourself, if only I had that house, I would be happy. There we are, we're complaining, right? Next time you step out of the shower and maybe you make the mistake of looking at yourself in the mirror, all right? And you might be tempted to think, if I looked like that person, or if I had their metabolism, right? We don't want to do that. Instead, you're going to look at yourself, you're going to smile, maybe you say to yourself, what's those 4 words again? It could be worse. It could be worse, yeah. It could be worse. We need some perspective. We need some perspective in our lives. I'm not going to try to embarrass Dustin McDonald. He's here with us. Dustin, as you know, comes to our church. He was baptized here a few months back, and And it's just been so cool to see Dustin growing in his faith. But Dustin had a stroke when he was in his 30s. And he is just continued to push on. You know, when I talk to him, I tell you what, Dustin, you always encourage me, buddy. Because you always have just a really good perspective on things. And the one thing that you've told me this multiple times when we've driven around, is that God used this to bring him to salvation. It's worth the wandering for the salvation. That's the perspective we need. Dustin's got a great perspective. Now, you know, when you look at the Israelite story, there's a temptation that's there. You might think to yourself, well, I wouldn't have been like them. If I'd have seen a pillar of cloud and fire and had all these miracles, that would not have been me. Really? When was the last time you had to eat leftovers and you complained about it? Or maybe you had to eat the same thing 3 days in a row and you complained about it. You know, I was reading this. There was a testimony from a woman who went on a short-term missionary trip to Tobago, and she worked in a leper colony that was there. The night before she left, she gathered up some of the leopards in the colony. There was about a dozen of them, and they decided to get together to worship. And she said, is there anyone who would like to sing a song? And then she asked, is there anyone who has a request? Anyone want to make a request? And this hand from the back of the room goes up, and she looked and she saw this woman who had this disfigured face from the leprosy. She had no nose, no ears, no lips. Her hand is raised, but there was no fingers. And she calls on the lady and she says, is there a song you would want us to sing? And here's what the lady responded. She wanted them to sing the hymn, Count Your Blessings. That's perspective. It could be worse. See, here's the point we need to remember today. The point today is that whining is the opposite of worship. Whining is the opposite of worship. We tend to get so focused on the negative that we lose track of what we have to be thankful for, and that God has enough. What we ultimately see in this story as we read here through chapter 6 is that a whole generation of Israel is lost because they never understood the practice of gratitude. For 39 or more years, they wandered. And my fear is that maybe we've lost the sense of gratitude. This generation today, we expect a lot of things, don't we? We have so much wealth, we have so much at our disposal, we just kind of take it for granted, and we lose track of how much we've been blessed. Again, whining is the opposite of worship. See, worship is giving glory to God for what He has done. Well, whining is ignoring who God is and what He has done. Will it be worship in your life, or will it be whining? Where are you at right now? Where do you want to be? Because our story is supposed to be about worship, giving glory to God. In Numbers chapter 14:11, it says, God says this, He says, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I mean, God's like, I've done so much for these people. Why do they keep complaining? What do I have to do? How much is enough? I hope that's not what God is thinking about you or me. See, the thing is that people who struggle with whining and complaining, which all of us have at some point, right? Let's be honest. We've all been there, whining and complaining. They often have this perspective. They think everything that God asks of me is too much, and everything that God's done for me isn't enough. Is that kind of where you're at right now? Maybe you think that He should do more for you somehow. And when we have that perspective, we lose. I mean, we have the perspective just like those in Israel. So again, you and me, many of us here in this room, those of you with us online today, you know, we find ourselves in that space in between. Don't lose sight of what God has already done and what God can still do, even when you're in the in-between, even when you're in the wilderness. You know, maybe this sounds, I'm sure a couple of little scenarios with you here. Maybe this sounds a little bit like you. Maybe you might be thinking, okay, yeah, God sent his son. And yeah, he did it because he loves me. Yeah, but God, I was wanting to retire next year, but my portfolio is down 30%, so I can't retire. There's the whining, right? Yeah, Jesus, he walked on the earth and he showed us how to live and he gave us hope and he's gone to prepare a place in heaven for us. Yeah, God, I get that, but these wrinkles around my eyes and my hairline, come on, God, let's get with it. Or yeah, Jesus, you died on the cross and you took the punishment that I deserve, but if I could just have a house like their house, that would make me happy. I mean, what is that? We're whining instead of worshiping. So, to wrap this up today, here's the thing. Is everything that God asks of you too much? Is everything that God's done for you isn't enough? And there's actually another statement I want to say. We need to acknowledge who God is and what he has done. We need to acknowledge who God is and what he has done. And so today, what would you say? Who are you? Are you a whiner or are you a worshiper? Okay, let's pray.